The village of Rose Hill had always prided itself on two things: the spectacular view from its namesake hilltop and the unassailable social authority of Mrs. Emmeline Calthorpe, who had been organizing the annual Rose Hill Photography Society Garden Fête for the past 7 years with the precision of a military campaign and the diplomacy of a seasoned ambassador. On this particular September afternoon, both were on magnificent display. The hill rose in a gentle green swell behind the village church, its crest offering panoramic views across the rolling countryside that had drawn photographers and artists for generations. Mrs. Calthorpe, resplendent in her best lavender silk and armed with a clipboard that she wielded like a field marshal's baton, moved through the assembled guests with practiced efficiency, ensuring that the cucumber sandwiches remained properly trimmed and that the local dignitary's wife understood exactly where she should position herself for maximum photographic advantage. Miss Jane Marple sat in a wicker chair beneath the spreading branches of an ancient oak, her knitting needles clicking with gentle rhythm as she worked on what might have been a baby's jacket, or perhaps a tea cozy. The pattern, she had informed several inquirers with a smile, would reveal its true nature in due course. To the casual observer, she appeared entirely absorbed in her handiwork, but her sharp blue eyes missed nothing of the complex social choreography unfolding around her. She was a guest of her old friend Mrs. Lavinia Rook, who lived in the ivy-covered cottage at the foot of Rose Hill and had insisted that Jane simply must experience a Rose Hill photography fête. "We're quite the artistic center of the county, you know," Lavinia had declared with evident pride. "Ever since that dreadful business with the development was finally settled, we've attracted the most interesting creative types." The dreadful business had been the proposed construction of modern houses on Rose Hill's summit, a controversy that had divided the village for nearly 2 years before being resolved in favor of preservation. The victory had been largely due to the efforts of Mrs. Vivian Ashford, the elegant widow who had inherited Meadowbrook House and had thrown both her considerable social influence and her not inconsiderable financial resources into the campaign to save the hill. Mrs. Ashford moved through the gathering now with the graceful confidence of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. She was a handsome woman in her early 50s, with silver-streaked hair arranged in an elaborate coiffure and wearing a dress that had clearly been chosen to complement the afternoon light. Everything about Vivian Ashford was calculated for effect, Miss Marple observed, from the strategic placement of the refreshment tables to ensure optimal circulation to the careful guest list that balanced old village families with the newer artistic residents who had been drawn to Rose Hill's scenic charms. "Such a marvelous turnout," Mrs. Ashford was saying to a small group gathered near the Rose Garden. "I do think we've managed to establish Rose Hill as quite the cultural destination. Why, we even have representatives from the London photography clubs joining us today." This was indeed true. The local Rose Hill Photography Society, a modest group that usually contented itself with capturing prize vegetables at harvest festivals, was playing host to several members of the prestigious Metropolitan Camera Club. The collision of these two worlds was providing Miss Marple with considerable entertainment, as she watched the subtle negotiations of artistic territory and social precedents unfold with all the complexity of international diplomacy. At the center of the visiting delegation stood Mr. Arthur Pemberton, a man whose considerable girth was matched only by his considerable opinion of his own expertise. He held court near the prize dahlia display, gesturing expansively with a cucumber sandwich as he explained the finer points of aperture settings to the thoroughly cowed local vicar. "The secret, Reverend, is understanding that photography is not merely about capturing what the eye sees, but what the soul perceives," Pemberton was declaring, spraying crumbs with evangelical fervor. "One must become one with the light itself." Miss Marple's attention, however, was drawn to a quieter drama playing out near the garden's edge. A young woman with copper-colored hair sat alone at a small table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had clearly grown cold some time ago. This was Alara Vance, who had returned to the village 6 months earlier after completing her studies at an art college in London. There was something indefinably melancholic about the girl, Miss Marple thought, something that reminded her of a pressed flower, beautiful but fragile, carrying the weight of some hidden sorrow. Elara was not alone in her solitude, however. Hovering at a respectful distance, clearly wanting to approach but lacking the courage, stood young Tom Miller, the village mechanic's son. His hands were clean for once, Miss Marple noted with amusement, and his usually unruly hair had been carefully combed. The boy was quite obviously smitten, though whether Elara was aware of his devotion was less certain. The dynamic shifted dramatically when the garden gate opened, and a new figure entered the scene. Julian Thorne moved with the sort of fluid confidence that drew every eye in the gathering, whether in admiration or apprehension. He was a man in his late 30s, darkly handsome in a way that suggested both artistic sensitivity and a certain dangerous unpredictability. His reputation had preceded him to Rose Hill. He was a successful portrait photographer whose work graced the covers of fashionable magazines, and who had recently taken a lease on the old manor house on the hill's eastern slope. Miss Marple watched with interest as Julian's arrival created ripples of reaction throughout the gathering. Mrs. Ashford's welcoming smile became slightly fixed, though she maintained her hostess's poise. Arthur Pemberton's lecture faltered momentarily as he reassessed the social hierarchy. Most tellingly, Elara Vance went pale and seemed to shrink further into her chair, while Tom Miller's expression darkened with unmistakable hostility. "Elara, my dear," Julian said, approaching her table with predatory grace. "How lovely to see you participating in village life. I thought you preferred the solitude of your dark room these days." "I'm a member of the Photography Society," Elara replied quietly, her voice barely audible above the garden party's gentle hum. "Of course you are, still chasing those artistic dreams we discussed." His smile was sharp-edged, carrying implications that made Miss Marple's knitting needles pause in their rhythm. "I understand you're planning to photograph the sunset from the hilltop this evening. The golden hour can be treacherous, you know. One might capture more than intended." Before Elara could respond, Mrs. Calthorpe's voice rang out across the garden with the authority of long practice. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I might have your attention, Mr. Sebastian Crane, our distinguished photographer from the city, has kindly offered to take a commemorative photograph of our gathering. If you would all please assemble near the fountain." Sebastian Crane was a man Miss Marple had been observing with particular interest. Unlike the bombastic Arthur Pemberton or the predatory Julian Thorne, Crane possessed a quiet intensity that spoke of genuine artistic dedication. He was perhaps 40, with prematurely silver hair and the sort of weathered hands that suggested years of working with chemicals and light. His camera was a professional affair, a large format device that required careful setup and precise positioning. As the guests arranged themselves with the usual confusion of such occasions, Miss Marple noted the subtle power dynamics at play. Mrs. Ashford positioned herself at the center, naturally, with Dr. Edmund Hartley, the village physician, at her right hand, a placement that Miss Marple found interesting, given the rumors that had been circulating about the widow's growing friendship with the recently divorced doctor. Julian Thorne inserted himself into the group with casual arrogance, while Elara Vance hung back at the edge, clearly reluctant to be included. Miss Marple herself declined to join the photograph, pleading the difficulty of rising from her comfortable chair. In truth, she preferred her vantage point, from which she could observe not only the subjects being photographed, but also Sebastian Crane as he worked behind his camera. The photographer was meticulous, adjusting angles and checking light with professional precision. But as he looked through his viewfinder, Miss Marple saw something flicker across his features, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. His hands, she noticed, trembled slightly as he made his final adjustments. "Perfect," Crane called out, his voice carefully controlled. "Please hold very still. This will be quite a memorable photograph, I think. On 3, 1, 2, 3. The shutter clicked with mechanical finality. As the group dispersed and conversation resumed, Miss Marple continued her observations. She noticed how Julian Thorne lingered near Ilara, his conversation too quiet to overhear, but clearly unwelcome based on the girl's increasingly distressed expression. She saw Tom Miller hovering nearby, his fists clenched with barely contained anger. She observed Mrs. Ashford's quick, nervous glances toward Dr. Hartley, and the way Sebastian Crane packed his equipment with unusual haste. The afternoon light was beginning to take on the golden quality that photographers prized, and several members of both societies began to make preparations for the traditional sunset expedition to Rose Hill's summit. It was a steep climb to the ancient folly that crowned the hill, but the panoramic views were considered worth the effort. Miss Marple watched from her chair as the small group of photographers began their ascent, their figures growing smaller against the hillside. Through her knitting, she kept track of who was climbing. Arthur Pemberton, huffing but determined. The vicar clutching his modest camera. Ilara Vance, walking alone despite Tom Miller's obvious desire to accompany her. Julian Thorne, moving with predatory purpose. And Sebastian Crane, bringing up the rear with his professional equipment. The sun continued its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. From her position in the garden, Miss Marple could see the tiny figures arranging themselves around the hilltop folly, each seeking the perfect vantage point for their photographs. It was at precisely 6:47 p.m., Miss Marple noted the time by the chiming of the church clock, that the scream tore through the evening air. The sound cut across the peaceful garden like a blade, silencing conversations and freezing teacups halfway to lips. Birds erupted from the trees in startled clouds, and several guests rose from their chairs with expressions of alarm. Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care and reached for her handbag. She had heard such screams before, in other villages and other circumstances, and she knew with the certainty of long experience that the peaceful afternoon had come to an abrupt and violent end. The telephone in Mrs. Ashford's house began to ring, its shrill tone adding to the growing sense of crisis. Within minutes, the news would spread through the village like wildfire. Julian Thorne had been found dead at the base of the folly, his camera smashed beside him, and Ilara Vance had been discovered standing over the body, her hand stained with what might have been blood, or might have been the chemicals from her photographer's darkroom. But as Miss Marple rose from her chair and prepared to climb Rose Hill despite her protesting knees, her mind was not on the obvious suspect or the apparent crime of passion. Instead, she found herself thinking about Sebastian Crane's trembling hands, about the flicker of recognition she had seen in his eyes as he looked through his camera's viewfinder, and about the way Mrs. Ashford's carefully orchestrated afternoon had suddenly revealed itself to be something far more sinister than a simple garden party. The last photograph taken on Rose Hill that day would indeed prove to be memorable, though not for the reasons anyone had anticipated. For in that seemingly innocent group portrait, frozen in the golden light of an English autumn afternoon, lay the key to a mystery that would test even Miss Marple's considerable understanding of human nature and its capacity for both love and murder. The climb up Rose Hill tested Miss Marple's endurance, though she maintained her steady pace with the aid of young Tom Miller, who had rushed down the path in considerable distress. The boy's face was flushed, his eyes holding a wildness that spoke of genuine shock rather than guilt. "It's Miss Vance, ma'am," he gasped as they climbed. "She's in a terrible state. They're saying she pushed him, but I know she couldn't have. She hasn't got it in her to hurt anyone." Miss Marple made a non-committal sound, conserving her breath for the steep incline. The path wound through beech trees before emerging onto the exposed hilltop, where the old folly commanded views across 3 counties. The scene that greeted them was one of controlled chaos. Dr. Hartley knelt beside Julian Thorne's body, though his examination was clearly a formality. The unnatural angle of the man's neck told its own story. The photographer had fallen from the folly's upper platform, a drop of perhaps 20 feet onto unforgiving stone. Elara Vance sat on a fallen column some distance away, her copper hair disheveled and her hands stained dark. Mrs. Calthorpe hovered nearby with evident disapproval, while Arthur Pemberton stood at a respectful distance, his earlier bombast deflated. Sebastian Crane was methodically packing his camera equipment, his movements mechanical and his face carefully blank. "The police have been telephoned," Mrs. Calthorpe announced grimly. "Until Inspector Craddock arrives, no one touches anything or attempts to leave." Miss Marple approached Elara quietly, settling beside the distraught young woman. Up close she could see that the stains on Elara's hands were photographic chemicals, the distinctive rust brown of developer solution mixed with the purple-black of fixing agent. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "perhaps you might tell me what happened." Elara looked at her with red-rimmed eyes. "I didn't push him. I was setting up my camera on the eastern side. Julian was on the platform above. We weren't speaking. Then I heard him cry out, and when I looked, he was lying there." "And you went to him?" "Of course. I thought I might help, but his neck was all wrong, and there was so much blood." Her voice broke. "Had Mr. Thorne said anything before he fell?" Elara frowned, trying to recall through her shock. "He called down to me just before it happened. Said something about the view being perfect, about how some photographs capture more than the photographer intends. Then he laughed and said he was looking forward to developing today's images." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle clicking as she processed this information. Around them, the golden hour was fading into dusk. "I was changing my lens," Arthur Pemberton interjected, having overheard. "Thorne was leaning over the parapet, shouting down at Miss Vance. Then he seemed to lose his balance." Sebastian Crane caught Miss Marple's eye as he secured his tripod. "I was setting up on the North Ridge," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "I didn't see the fall, only heard the impact." Miss Marple studied the scene with growing interest. Julian's expensive Italian loafers were remarkably clean for someone who had supposedly climbed the muddy path from the garden party. If he had come the same route as the others, his shoes should have been caked with damp earth. "Constable," she said to the young officer who had arrived breathless, "before the light fails, might you examine the loose stone on the upper parapet? And perhaps someone should retrieve Mr. Thorne's camera. If he was photographing when he fell, it might tell us something." The constable nodded, though he looked uncertain about taking direction from an elderly lady with knitting needles. As shadows lengthened and the first stars appeared, Miss Marple knew the picture of what happened on Rose Hill was far from complete. Julian Thorne's cryptic final words about photographs capturing unintended things, his impossibly clean shoes, and the calculating look in Sebastian Crane's eyes all suggested that this apparent accident was, like a double exposure, two stories layered over one another, waiting to be properly developed. Inspector Craddock arrived as the last light faded from Rose Hill, his solid figure emerging from the police motor car with the measured confidence of a man accustomed to untangling the complexities of human nature. He paused at the sight of Miss Marple, still seated composedly on her stone perch, knitting needles glinting in the torchlight. "Aunt Jane," he said with a mixture of affection and resignation that spoke of previous encounters, "I might have known you'd be present when peaceful village life takes a murderous turn." "Such a coincidence, Inspector," Miss Marple replied mildly, though her sharp eyes missed nothing of his preliminary survey of the scene. "I had hoped for nothing more dramatic than oversweetened tea and competing opinions about aperture settings." Craddock's examination of Julian Thorne's body was methodical and thorough. The photographer lay crumpled at the base of the folly, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle that spoke eloquently of the fatal impact. His expensive camera lay smashed beside him, its brass fittings gleaming mockingly in the artificial light. Above them, the stone parapet of the folly's observation platform showed clear signs of recent disturbance, several loose stones scattered on the ancient flagstones. Accidental death appears the obvious conclusion, Craddock mused aloud, though his tone suggested professional skepticism. Leaned too far over while composing a photograph, the old stonework gave way. These follies are notoriously unsafe. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their rhythm. And yet, Inspector, there is the curious matter of Mr. Thorne's footwear. Craddock followed her gaze to the deceased's Italian leather shoes, their polished surfaces reflecting the torchlight with pristine clarity. He then looked at the muddy boots of everyone else present, liberally decorated with the clay and earth of the steep hillside path. "Extraordinary," he murmured, crouching for a closer examination. "Not a speck of mud. He must have come by another route entirely." Sebastian Crane, who had been standing quietly with his camera equipment, cleared his throat. "Inspector, there is a disused service track on the eastern slope. It once served the old manor before the main road was built. The surface is mostly gravel and stone, much drier than the main path." "You're familiar with this alternative route, Mr. Crane?" "I explored the area thoroughly when I first arrived. Topography is crucial for a photographer seeking the best vantage points." Crane's voice was carefully neutral, but Miss Marple noted how his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his equipment case. Dr. Hartley, who had been attending to the shaken Alara Vance, approached with obvious reluctance. "Inspector, I feel I must mention that Julian Thorne consulted me professionally last week. Patient confidentiality prevents detailed discussion, but he expressed concerns about his personal safety. He believed someone was following him." This revelation sent a visible tremor through the assembled group. What had appeared to be a tragic accident was rapidly acquiring more sinister dimensions. Arthur Pemberton, sensing an opportunity to reclaim his earlier authority, stepped forward with ponderous importance. "Inspector, I'm afraid Julian Thorne's reputation in photographic circles was not entirely savory. He was known for acquiring compromising images and using them for professional advancement. Several prominent individuals found their private indiscretions exposed after declining to provide him with opportunities." Mrs. Calthorpe gasped at this breach of propriety, while Mrs. Ashford went noticeably pale. Miss Marple observed how the widow's grip tightened on her handbag, her knuckles showing white in the torchlight. Tom Miller, who had remained protectively close to Alara, suddenly burst out with youthful indignation. "He was blackmailing Miss Vance. I heard them arguing outside her cottage last month. He claimed to have photographs from her London days, things he threatened to make public unless she helped him secure a commission." Alara's composure finally cracked, and she buried her face in her stained hands. "They weren't what he made them sound like," she whispered. "Art studies from college, perfectly respectable work. But Julian twisted everything, made it sound sordid and scandalous." Miss Marple studied the young woman with growing interest, particularly the dark stains on her hands that everyone had assumed were photographic chemicals. Moving closer, she detected the distinctive metallic scent that suggested something rather different. "My dear," she said gently to Tom Miller, "the iron railing on the Folly's upper platform. Is it in good repair?" Tom looked puzzled by the question. "Oh, no, Miss Marple. It's been rusting for years. Flakes off something dreadful if you touch it." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The stains on Alara's hands might indeed be a mixture of developer solution and iron rust, evidence that she had grasped the railing, but whether to push or to save remained the crucial question. As the group prepared to descend to Meadowbrook House for formal questioning, Miss Marple caught a whispered exchange between Mrs. Ashford and Dr. Hartley that made her knitting needles still completely. "I cannot tell him that, Vivian," the doctor was saying urgently. "It changes everything about this afternoon." "You must," Mrs. Ashford replied with desperate intensity. "If you don't, they'll blame that poor child for circumstances entirely beyond her control." Inspector Craddock, observing Miss Marple's sudden attention, approached quietly. "What is it, Aunt Jane?" "Only that Rose Hill's Peaceful Photography Society appears to have been harboring rather more secrets than anyone suspected," she replied thoughtfully. and I fear we have only begun to develop the full picture of what transpired on this hilltop today. The drawing room of Meadowbrook House had been transformed into an impromptu interrogation chamber, its rose-patterned wallpaper and polished mahogany providing an incongruously genteel backdrop for Inspector Craddock's methodical questioning. Miss Marple occupied a wing-back chair near the fireplace, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she observed the proceedings with the quiet attention of someone accustomed to reading human nature through its smallest gestures. Arthur Pemberton was summoned first, his earlier bombast deflated into nervous perspiration. He dabbed his forehead repeatedly while recounting his movements on the hilltop, emphasizing his focus on the western vista and his professional dedication to capturing the perfect light. "Thorne was behind us during the ascent," he testified with wounded dignity. "He made some remark about saving the best position for a master photographer. Arrogant fellow, but hardly worth murdering over artistic differences." When pressed about their professional relationship, Pemberton's composure cracked slightly. Julian possessed technical skill but no artistic soul. His success came from manipulation rather than merit. 3 years ago, he stole a commission by presenting compromising photographs of the client's daughter. The family paid handsomely to suppress those images. Elara Vance entered next, her hands now scrubbed clean but trembling as she twisted a handkerchief. Her testimony revealed the true scope of Julian's blackmail activities. "He discovered irregularities in my father's business dealings before his death," she admitted quietly. "Julian threatened to destroy my family's reputation unless I helped him authenticate a series of supposedly lost masterpiece photographs he planned to sell to collectors." "So you had compelling reason to silence him," Craddock observed. "I despised him," Elara replied with surprising firmness. "But I didn't push him. When I reached my position below the folly, he was already on the platform, laughing. He said he'd found something better than fake masterpieces. He called it his golden goose." Miss Marple's knitting paused imperceptibly at this phrase. In her experience, when men like Julian Thorne spoke of golden geese, they meant sources of endless profit. Tom Miller's interview revealed his protective devotion to Elara and confirmed his presence near the folly's base. His muddy boots and genuine distress marked him as an unlikely killer, though his obvious infatuation provided clear motive. Sebastian Crane's questioning proved more intriguing. The silver-haired photographer maintained careful composure while explaining his solitary approach to the hilltop and his positioning on the northern ridge. However, Miss Marple interrupted gently. "Mr. Crane, I couldn't help noticing that your camera was fitted with a portrait lens this afternoon, hardly suitable for landscape photography." Crane's mask slipped momentarily, revealing something calculating beneath. "I intended to capture candid portraits of the guests against the scenery," he replied stiffly. "Of course," Miss Marple smiled, "though you packed your equipment remarkably quickly after taking the group photograph, almost as if you had captured exactly what you came for." Dr. Hartley's testimony introduced a crucial medical dimension. "Julian consulted me last week about severe vertigo episodes," the physician revealed reluctantly. "I warned him explicitly to avoid elevated positions like the folly. The condition made climbing to such heights extremely dangerous." "Did anyone else know of this medical issue?" Craddock inquired. Dr. Hartley's gaze flickered toward Mrs. Ashford, who sat rigid in the adjacent drawing room. When the widow herself was questioned, her testimony transformed the investigation entirely. Mrs. Ashford admitted with evident distress that Julian had been blackmailing her for months over photographs of her late husband's questionable business dealings. "He demanded money and social introductions. This afternoon, he informed me the price had increased. He wanted access to my friends' private lives, and he said today's group photograph would prove I had no choice but to cooperate." "Where exactly were you when Julian fell?" Craddock asked carefully. "On the lower path, returning to the garden. I felt unwell and left early. Dr. Hartley accompanied me partway down before returning for his camera." Miss Marple observed how Mrs. Ashford's hands clenched as she spoke. and how no one had actually mentioned seeing her descent. As the interviews concluded, Inspector Craddock turned to the crucial evidence. "Mr. Crane, I'll need your camera and the undeveloped film from today's group photograph, along with whatever remains of Mr. Thorne's equipment." Crane agreed with apparent cooperation, though Miss Marple noticed his anxious glance toward his camera bag. The commemorative photograph, still undeveloped in Sebastian Crane's possession, was rapidly becoming the key to understanding what had truly occurred on Rose Hill. For if Julian Thorne had discovered his golden goose in that gathered assembly, the image might reveal not just the faces of the suspects, but the secret worth killing for. The small dark room at the rear of Meadowbrook House had not been used since Mr. Ashford's amateur photographic pursuits, but under Inspector Craddock's direction, it became the most crucial room in Rose Hill. The familiar scent of developer and fixer chemicals filled the cramped space as Sebastian Crane worked with methodical precision, though Miss Marple noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he handled the photographic plates. Elara Vance assisted in silence, finding comfort in the familiar ritual of development. The rhythmic swaying of paper through chemical baths offered a fragile sense of normalcy amid the chaos. Inspector Craddock hovered uncomfortably near the door, clearly out of his element in the red-lit chamber, while Miss Marple observed everything with her characteristic, quiet intensity. The first revelation came not from what the photographs showed, but from what they didn't. As Crane examined Julian Thorne's damaged camera, Miss Marple made a startling discovery. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, extracting the film holder from the camera's back. "This is quite empty. Mr. Thorne climbed Rose Hill with his professional camera, but loaded no film whatsoever." Craddock leaned forward sharply. "You're suggesting he never intended to photograph the sunset?" "I'm suggesting that a man suffering from severe vertigo, explicitly warned by his physician to avoid heights, would not risk such a dangerous climb for mere aesthetic purposes. He went to Rose Hill for an entirely different reason, and photography was simply his excuse." This revelation transformed their understanding completely. Julian had not been a victim of photographic passion, but had deliberately positioned himself on that deadly platform for purposes unknown. The second crucial discovery emerged as Sebastian's group photograph materialized in the developer. The large-format camera had captured extraordinary detail, revealing not just faces, but telling expressions and gestures. Mrs. Ashford stood at the center, her smile brittle and her knuckles white as she gripped her handbag with desperate intensity. Dr. Hartley appeared beside her, his protective positioning suggesting intimacy beyond mere friendship. Most significantly, Julian Thorne had inserted himself at the frame's edge, not looking at the camera, but directing his gaze with predatory focus toward Dr. Hartley. In his hands, he clutched a slim rectangular object, not a camera, which hung from his shoulder, but what appeared to be a photograph folder. "He was watching the doctor specifically," Miss Marple observed quietly, "and carrying something he considered valuable enough to display publicly." The third photograph, salvaged from Julian's damaged camera despite the empty film holder, showed his final image, the view from the Folly looking down at the assembled photographers. But more importantly, it captured a lone figure on the lower path, Mrs. Ashford, clearly identifiable despite the distance, positioned near the gorse bushes rather than returning to the house as she had claimed. Dr. Hartley's subsequent confession provided the missing context. The physician entered their makeshift headquarters with evident reluctance, his professional composure cracking under conscience's weight. "Inspector, I must reveal something crucial," he began heavily. "Mrs. Ashford and I have developed feelings for one another. Her husband's death 2 years ago was officially heart failure, but there were irregularities I chose not to pursue at the time," he continued with obvious difficulty. Julian Thorne had somehow discovered these irregularities. He possessed photographs of Mr. Ashford taken shortly before his death, showing him in apparent good health. He was using these to suggest the death was unnatural, threatening to reopen the case unless Vivian paid continuously for his silence. The constable's report about the Eastern Service Track provided another piece of the puzzle. Fresh tire tracks and disturbed vegetation suggested someone had used that route recently, explaining Julian's impossibly clean shoes. The gravel surface would have allowed access to the hilltop without the muddy evidence that marked every other climber. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their steady rhythm as she processed these revelations. The empty camera, the hidden approach route, the threatening photograph folder, and Dr. Hartley's confession painted a picture of escalating blackmail that had reached a deadly crescendo. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe Mr. Thorne had moved beyond simple individual blackmail. His reference to finding a golden goose suggests he had discovered something that connected multiple victims, something worth far more than isolated secrets." As the red light cast eerie shadows across the developed photographs, it became clear that Julian Thorne's death was not the simple crime of passion it had initially appeared. Instead, it was the violent culmination of a web of secrets, lies, and desperate people pushed beyond their limits. The question now was, which of Rose Hill's respectable residents had finally decided that murder was preferable to continued exposure? The morning mist clung to Rose Hill like a shroud, transforming the village into something from a Gothic novel rather than the peaceful English countryside it had been 24 hours earlier. Miss Marple observed this atmospheric change from the breakfast room at Meadowbrook House, where Inspector Craddock was methodically reviewing his notes while consuming Mrs. Ashford's excellent marmalade on toast. "Three compelling motives," Craddock mused between bites. "Yet something feels incomplete about our understanding of Mr. Thorne's activities. A man doesn't climb a dangerous hill with an empty camera unless he expects to find something more valuable than photographs." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm. "Indeed, Inspector, perhaps we should examine where Mr. Thorne actually lived, rather than where he died. Men who trade in secrets rarely resist the temptation to collect them." Julian Thorne's lodgings above the post office proved as revealing as Miss Marple had anticipated. The rooms were expensively furnished but curiously impersonal, lacking any trace of genuine human habitation. Craddock's systematic search initially yielded little beyond expensive clothing and hotel receipts, until Miss Marple's attention was drawn to an ornate writing desk whose proportions seemed slightly wrong. "The depth is inconsistent," she observed quietly, running her fingers along the desk's interior. "There should be more space." Craddock's investigation revealed a hidden compartment containing a locked metal box. The key, discovered taped beneath monogrammed handkerchiefs, opened onto Julian's true profession: systematic blackmail conducted with businesslike efficiency. The photographs were meticulously organized in labeled envelopes. Some documented indiscretions in London, hotels, others captured respectable gentlemen entering questionable establishments. But the envelope marked Rose Hill contained the most disturbing collection: images of virtually every prominent villager in compromising situations, from clandestine meetings to suspicious financial transactions. Most significantly, one photograph showed Sebastian Crane's manor house with a feminine silhouette visible in an upstairs window, contradicting his presentation as a solitary gentleman. Another captured Dr. Hartley leaving Meadowbrook House through the side entrance at midnight, his hand intimately placed on Mrs. Ashford's arm. "He was building a comprehensive dossier on the entire community," Craddock observed grimly. "Not isolated blackmail, but systematic control." Miss Marple studied a particular image with growing interest. It showed the manor's darkroom window, and through careful examination, she could discern photography equipment far more sophisticated than Sebastian Crane had admitted possessing. "Inspector, I believe our quiet artist has been less than truthful about his professional capabilities." Their investigation was interrupted by urgent knocking. A constable reported that Sebastian Crane had arrived voluntarily at the station, requesting to make a statement. His confession proved illuminating. He had recognized Julian Thorne during the group photograph as James Thornberry, a former assistant who had stolen negatives from Crane's London studio years earlier, destroying his business before disappearing. When I saw him positioning himself to threaten Dr. Hartley with that photograph folder, I realized he was continuing his criminal career under a new identity, Crane admitted with obvious relief. I've been living in fear of exposure myself, using forged credentials to rebuild my reputation here. This revelation transformed the investigation's scope. Julian Thorne was not merely an opportunistic blackmailer, but a career criminal who had systematically infiltrated Rose Hill to exploit its residents' secrets. The discovery of Tom Miller's hidden satchel near the Folly provided the final piece of Julian's scheme. Inside were detailed financial records showing regular payments from multiple victims, along with a notebook listing future targets. Mrs. Calthorpe appeared alongside references to committee fund irregularities, while the vicar was noted for questionable charitable donations. Most disturbing was Julian's master plan, outlined in coded notes. He intended to use his accumulated leverage to force through the housing development on Rose Hill, profiting from both the blackmail payments and the eventual land sale. Miss Marple absorbed these revelations with characteristic calm, though her knitting needles had stilled completely. Inspector, we now understand why Mr. Thorne climbed that hill despite his medical condition. He wasn't seeking photographic opportunities, but planning to confront someone with evidence that would ensure their cooperation in his scheme. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the village, the investigation had revealed a web of interconnected secrets that touched nearly every household in Rose Hill. Yet the crucial question remained unanswered. Which of Julian's many victims had finally decided that murder was preferable to continued submission to his demands? The answer, Miss Marple suspected, lay not in the obvious motives they had uncovered, but in understanding the precise sequence of events during those fatal minutes on the hilltop when blackmail had transformed into murder. The morning after Julian Thorne's death brought no peace to Rose Hill, only the relentless churn of village speculation. Miss Marple observed from Mrs. Rook's front window as clusters of residents gathered at garden gates and shop doorways, their voices carrying fragments of increasingly elaborate theories. By noon, Julian had transformed from a mere blackmailer into everything from a foreign spy to a supernatural entity, depending upon which household one consulted. Human nature abhors a vacuum, Miss Marple remarked gently to Lavinia, who was breathlessly recounting Mrs. Calthorpe's latest pronouncement about Julian's supposedly suspicious photographic equipment. When facts are scarce, imagination rushes in to fill the void, often obscuring the simpler truths that lie beneath. Their philosophical discussion was interrupted by urgent knocking. Tom Miller stood at the door, his usual composure replaced by evident distress. Miss Marple, Inspector Craddock needs you at the Folly immediately. They found something that changes everything about Mr. Thorne's death. The discovery at the Folly. The climb tested Miss Marple's endurance once more, though she maintained her steady pace with Tom's respectful assistance. At the summit, Inspector Craddock stood examining the ancient stone parapet with a magnifying glass, his expression grim with new understanding. "Look at this, Aunt Jane," he said, indicating deep scratches in the weathered masonry. "These marks are fresh, made within the last few days. Someone deliberately loosened several stones in this section, creating what amounts to a death trap for anyone who leaned against it." Miss Marple examined the evidence carefully, noting how the sabotaged stones would have appeared perfectly secure until weight was applied. The work had been done with considerable skill, using tools that left minimal traces. "Premeditated murder disguised as accident," she observed quietly. "Yet this presents us with a curious paradox, Inspector." "How so?" "Because such preparation suggests the killer could not predict precisely when Mr. Thorne would visit the Folly, only that he eventually would. Yet our evidence indicates Julian arrived by the eastern track specifically to confront someone during yesterday's gathering. The timing was deliberate on his part, not necessarily the killer's." Before Craddock could respond, Arthur Pemberton appeared at the Folly's entrance, his usual bombast replaced by obvious distress. "Inspector, I must speak with you. I can no longer bear the weight of what I witnessed yesterday." Pemberton's confession. The photography enthusiast's testimony proved illuminating, though not in the way anyone expected. "I followed Julian to the Folly," he admitted, his hands trembling as he spoke. "He possessed evidence of my professional dishonesty. Those prize-winning photographs I claimed were stolen from a student's portfolio. We argued on the platform, and I'll admit I grabbed his lapels in anger." "Did you push him?" Craddock asked directly. "No, but something extraordinary happened. As we struggled, Julian suddenly looked over my shoulder, and his expression changed completely, from arrogance to genuine terror. He stepped backward, forgetting where he was, and simply fell. Someone else was approaching the Folly, someone whose presence frightened a hardened blackmailer more than physical confrontation." This revelation introduced a third party to the crime scene, someone whose identity had remained hidden by the Folly's structure during those crucial moments. The financial web revealed. Tom Miller's earlier observation about land development proved more prescient than anyone had realized. Miss Marple's request to examine the original development documents revealed a web of financial connections that cast the entire preservation campaign in a different light. Vivian Ashford appears as a minor shareholder in Larkspur Holdings, Inspector Craddock read from the legal papers in Mr. Penfold's office. Early investor with a clause granting additional percentage upon successful planning approval. The investment predates her public opposition to the development by several months. Mrs. Rook gasped at this revelation. But Vivian led the preservation campaign so passionately, she organized every protest meeting. "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured thoughtfully. "Rather like dear Mrs. Hartwell in St. Mary Mead, who always protested most vehemently against changes she secretly favored. A form of social camouflage that provides perfect cover for one's true intentions." The timeline paradox. Dr. Hartley's subsequent interview provided crucial details about the critical timeline. "I accompanied Vivian partway down the hill, leaving her near the gorse bushes on the lower path," he explained with obvious reluctance. "Perhaps 10 minutes passed before we heard Julian's scream. I had returned to collect my camera equipment and was adjusting my tripod when the cry rang out." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused as she processed this information. 10 minutes would be insufficient for Mrs. Ashford to climb back to the Folly, confront Mr. Thorne, and return to her position on the lower path. Yet Julian's final photograph captured her in that exact location, suggesting she remained there throughout the critical period. "Then she couldn't have pushed him," Craddock concluded. "Not directly, perhaps, but we must consider that preparation and execution are not always performed by the same hands." Miss Marple's deduction. As evening shadows lengthened across Rose Hill, Miss Marple sat in contemplative silence, her knitting abandoned as she worked through the puzzle's final pieces. The loosened stones, the financial motivations, the mysterious third party, and the timeline all suggested a more complex scheme than simple murder. "Inspector," she said finally, "I believe we have been approaching this investigation from an incorrect assumption. We have sought to identify who pushed Mr. Thorne from the parapet, when perhaps the more pertinent question is whether the trap was set for him specifically, or whether he simply became an unfortunate victim of a scheme intended for someone else entirely." The revelation that would solve the mystery of Rose Hill lay not in who had killed Julian Thorne, but in understanding that his death might have been the wrong murder altogether. A case of a blackmailer stumbling into a trap set for an entirely different victim, with consequences that would shake the village's carefully maintained facade to its very foundations. As darkness fell over the hill, Miss Marple knew that tomorrow would bring the final revelation, when all of Rose Hill's buried secrets would finally be exposed in the harsh light of truth. The morning brought an unexpected breakthrough that would transform the entire investigation. Elara Vance appeared at Meadowbrook House carrying a leather portfolio, her pale face showing newfound determination despite the tremor in her hands. She had requested Miss Marple's presence specifically, a detail that intrigued Inspector Craddock as he received them in the drawing room, where golden sunlight streamed through the tall windows. The photographic evidence. Elara spread a series of photographs across the mahogany table with the careful precision of someone handling precious evidence. "I've been developing my own images from yesterday evening," she explained, her voice steadier than it had been since Julian's death. "I was using a time-lapse technique, capturing frames every 30 seconds from my position below the folly. I thought they might help establish what really happened during those final minutes." The sequence told a story more complex than anyone had anticipated. Miss Marple examined each image through her small magnifying glass, her knitting forgotten as she absorbed the visual narrative. The first photograph showed Julian Thorne alone on the upper platform, his posture relaxed as he surveyed the landscape below. The second revealed Arthur Pemberton's arrival and their evident confrontation, both men's body language suggesting heated argument. But the third image captured something extraordinary, a distinct shadow falling across the platform from the folly's eastern side, indicating someone approaching from the direction invisible to both Elara's position and Pemberton's view. The shadow lengthened progressively across the subsequent frames, showing deliberate and unhurried movement toward the platform. "This changes our understanding completely," Inspector Craddock murmured, studying the progression with growing intensity. "Someone else was present during those crucial moments, someone who used the folly's architecture to remain undetected by the obvious witnesses." Miss Marple noted how the approaching figure had moved with calculated purpose rather than chance encounter. "Inspector, observe how methodically this person approached. The shadow's progression suggests someone familiar with the folly's layout, someone who knew precisely how to remain hidden while positioning themselves for whatever they intended." The confession and timeline. The photographic evidence led directly to Mrs. Calthorpe's tearful confession later that morning. The formidable organizer of Rose Hill's social calendar crumbled under questioning, admitting she had climbed to the folly using the concealed Eastern approach after Julian had confronted her about irregularities in the Photography Society's accounts. "He demanded immediate payment of money I had already spent on essential family matters," she explained, her usual authority dissolving into desperate vulnerability. "I went to plead with him privately, to explain that exposure would destroy not just my reputation, but my daughter's medical treatment in Switzerland. When I reached the platform, he was arguing with Mr. Pemberton. I waited in the shadows, hoping for a private moment to negotiate." Her testimony provided crucial timeline details. "Julian saw me waiting, and his expression changed completely, from anger to calculating amusement. He stepped backward, laughing about how convenient it was that multiple victims had arrived to settle their accounts simultaneously. That's when he lost his balance and fell." Miss Marple's gentle questioning revealed another significant detail. "Mrs. Calthorpe, did you notice anything unusual about the parapet stones during your visit?" "Now that you mention it, several stones did seem loose when I grasped the railing for support. I remember thinking the folly was becoming dangerously unstable, though it had always seemed solid before." The darkroom investigation. Miss Marple's afternoon visit to Sebastian Crane's manor house, ostensibly seeking advice about a quite hopeless little camera, proved illuminating in ways the photographer had not anticipated. The darkroom he had hastily shown Inspector Craddock earlier was now displayed with relaxed pride, though Miss Marple's trained observation detected details others had missed. The space contained equipment far more sophisticated than Sebastian had initially admitted, including a second enlarger positioned behind a cabinet and a locked metal case whose key he wore around his neck. Most tellingly, faint discoloration on the floor indicated where heavy equipment had recently been moved and removed. "You work here entirely alone, Mr. Crane?" Miss Marple inquired with innocent curiosity. "So peaceful after the complications of London life. No assistance from your former career visiting to, shall we say, discuss old business." Sebastian's composure flickered almost imperceptibly. "I value solitude, Miss Marple. It sharpens one's artistic focus." "Quite understandable," she agreed pleasantly, "though I do recall hearing that darkroom work can be challenging for those who suffer from sudden dizzy spells. Poor Mr. Thorne's vertigo made climbing to dangerous heights so very risky, didn't it? Unless, of course, someone had assured him they would meet him there to provide assistance." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the gentle drip of chemicals. When Sebastian finally laughed, the sound carried too much tension, too much forced casualness. The financial web revealed. Inspector Craddock's investigation into the development scheme's financial structure revealed connections that cast Mrs. Ashford's preservation campaign in an entirely different light. Sebastian's photographic commission proved particularly significant. Mrs. Ashford had paid handsomely for comprehensive documentation of Rose Hill's historical structures, with particular emphasis on areas of structural weakness that might support arguments against public access. Dr. Hartley's reluctant admission provided the final crucial piece. His medical records showed that Mrs. Ashford had been consulting him for severe anxiety related to someone from her past who had recently appeared in the village. The consultations had begun 3 months earlier, coinciding precisely with Julian Thorne's arrival in Rose Hill. "She knew him before his blackmail began," Miss Marple observed quietly to Inspector Craddock as they reviewed the evidence. This was not opportunistic exploitation by a stranger, but something far more personal and dangerous. Mr. Thorne came to Rose Hill specifically because Mrs. Ashford was here, and she had been preparing for his eventual approach long before yesterday's tragic events. The trap's true purpose. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the village, Miss Marple sat in contemplative silence, her knitting needles moving with mechanical precision, while her mind worked through the puzzle's increasingly complex pattern. The sabotaged parapet, the financial motivations, the hidden approaches, and the carefully documented structural weaknesses all suggested a level of premeditation that extended far beyond simple murder. "Inspector," she said finally, setting down her knitting with deliberate care, "I believe we have been approaching this investigation from an incorrect assumption. We have sought to identify who pushed Mr. Thorne from the parapet, when perhaps the more pertinent question is whether he was the intended victim at all." The revelation transformed their understanding completely. The trap had been set days earlier, before anyone could have predicted Julian's specific movements or his decision to climb the folly during yesterday's gathering. Someone had prepared that deadly parapet for an entirely different victim, and Julian Thorne had simply stumbled into a scheme designed for someone else entirely. As evening approached, Miss Marple knew that tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, when all of Rose Hill's carefully buried secrets would be exposed, and the true intended victim of that sabotaged parapet would finally be revealed. The photographer's death had been tragic, but it was merely the wrong murder in a plan that was still waiting to claim its real target. The morning fog that shrouded Rose Hill seemed to mirror the obscured truth that Miss Marple was finally prepared to illuminate. She had requested a gathering at Meadowbrook House, ostensibly for Inspector Craddock to present his preliminary findings, but in reality to conduct one final test of human nature under the guise of official procedure. The psychological test. The assembled suspects sat in Mrs. Ashford's drawing room with the careful spacing of people who no longer trusted one another completely. Sebastian Crane positioned himself near the tall windows, his camera equipment case resting protectively at his feet. Mrs. Ashford maintained her composure on the velvet settee, though her hands betrayed her anxiety through their constant movement. Dr. Hartley hovered nearby with obvious concern, while Mrs. Calthorpe sat rigidly upright, her usual authority somewhat diminished by recent revelations. Miss Marple had arranged for a single photograph to be displayed prominently on the mahogany table, one of Ilara's time-lapse images, carefully selected to show the Follies platform from an angle that revealed the loosened stones. The image was partially covered with tracing paper, creating an air of incomplete revelation that would test each suspect's reaction to what they believed might be evidence of their guilt. Inspector Craddock began his presentation with deliberate formality. Ladies and gentlemen, our investigation has revealed that Julian Thorne's death was not the simple accident it initially appeared. The parapet stones were deliberately loosened days before his fall, creating what amounts to a death trap for anyone who leaned against that particular section. Miss Marple observed each face carefully as Craddock spoke, noting the subtle tells that revealed guilty knowledge. Sebastian's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his equipment case when the inspector mentioned premeditation. His eyes went immediately to the covered photograph, then flickered briefly toward Mrs. Ashford, a glance that lasted no more than a heartbeat, but revealed volumes about his true concerns, the crucial revelation. However, Miss Marple interjected gently, setting down her knitting. I believe we have been approaching this investigation from an incorrect assumption. Inspector, would you please uncover the photograph completely? As the tracing paper was removed, the image revealed the Follies' eastern approach, where someone of Mrs. Ashford's height and bearing might naturally stand to admire the view. The positioning was deliberate, designed to test Sebastian's reaction to what he might believe was evidence of his intended victim. You see, Miss Marple continued conversationally, Mr. Thorne was not the intended victim at all. The trap was set for someone whose visits to the Folly were regular and predictable, someone who had been photographed there extensively as part of a preservation campaign. Mrs. Ashford's composure finally cracked as the implication became clear. Miss Marple, surely you don't think someone wanted to harm me? I'm afraid that's exactly what I think, my dear. But first, we must understand why Mr. Thorne came to Rose Hill in the first place. Miss Marple's gentle gaze settled on the widow. He wasn't a stranger to you, was he, Vivian? He was your late husband's business partner, the man who disappeared when their property development schemes faced exposure. The confession came in fragments, each revelation more damaging than the last. Mrs. Ashford admitted that Julian, then using his real name of James Thornberry, had been involved in fraudulent land deals with her husband. When their activities faced investigation, her husband had suffered his fatal heart attack, and Julian had vanished with substantial funds, leaving her to rebuild her reputation through carefully orchestrated charitable works. When he returned 3 months ago, he demanded that I use my social position to facilitate new schemes, Vivian explained, her voice hollow with exhaustion. The preservation campaign became his cover for identifying wealthy targets. He threatened to expose everything if I didn't cooperate. Sebastian's fatal miscalculation. Miss Marple's attention turned to Sebastian Crane, whose careful composure was beginning to show cracks. Mr. Crane, you arrived in Rose Hill several months before Mr. Thorne, didn't you? Under circumstances that were not entirely truthful about your background. Sebastian's jaw tightened. I came here for a fresh start, away from London's complications. Indeed, away from the complications caused when your former assistant, James Thornberry, as we now know him, stole your work and destroyed your professional reputation. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but her words carried devastating precision. When Mrs. Ashford commissioned you to document the Follies' condition, you saw an opportunity for revenge that was simply too perfect to resist. The psychological pressure was mounting visibly. Sebastian's hands trembled as he gripped his camera case, and perspiration beaded on his forehead despite the room's coolness. You loosened those stones intending to create what would appear to be a tragic accident during one of Mrs. Ashford's regular visits, Miss Marple continued relentlessly. You had documented her habits thoroughly during your photography sessions. You knew she often walked to the Folly when troubled, and with Julian's blackmail increasing her distress, you could predict she would visit frequently. But why would you want to harm Mrs. Ashford? Dr. Hartley demanded, his protective instincts aroused. Miss Marple smiled sadly. Because, Doctor, Mr. Crane had discovered something that made Mrs. Ashford far more valuable to him alive than dead, at least initially. He learned about her past connection to Julian, about the blackmail, and about her genuine fear and isolation. A wealthy, anxious widow, increasingly dependent on the steady presence of a quiet, understanding photographer who documented her fears while offering comfort. The final confrontation. Sebastian's careful mask finally slipped completely. "You're suggesting I courted Vivian for financial gain. I'm suggesting you saw an opportunity to solve multiple problems simultaneously," Miss Marple replied calmly. "Eliminate the source of your professional disgrace, inherit a comfortable fortune through a grateful widow's will, and establish yourself as the hero who had tried to protect her from the very dangers you had created." The silence stretched taut as Sebastian realized his position had become untenable. Inspector Craddock stepped forward with quiet authority. "Mr. Crane, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Julian Thorne and the attempted murder of Mrs. Vivian Ashford." As the constables led Sebastian away, his final words carried the bitter irony of a plan that had destroyed itself. "He wasn't supposed to climb that folly. I told him about his vertigo, warned him it was dangerous. The arrogant fool killed himself with his own greed." The aftermath. As Rosehill began to process the shocking revelation that their quiet artist had been a calculating killer, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic chain of events that had led to this moment. Julian Thorne's blackmail had created the perfect storm of fear and desperation that Sebastian had exploited, but his own arrogance had ultimately triggered the trap meant for another. "Human nature," she murmured to Inspector Craddock as they watched the police car disappear down the hill, "so often reveals itself most clearly in the elaborate lengths people will go to hide their true intentions." Mr. Crane thought he was being terribly clever, but in the end he was undone by the very predictability of human behavior that he had tried to exploit. The last photograph taken on Rosehill had indeed captured more than anyone intended, not in its visible image, but in the web of secrets and lies it had helped to unravel, exposing the darkness that can lurk beneath even the most peaceful English village's genteel surface. The autumn light filtering through Meadowbrook House's tall windows seemed softer now, as if Rosehill itself was exhaling after holding its breath through days of revelation. Miss Marple sat in her familiar chair, knitting needles moving with gentle precision, as Inspector Craddock concluded his final interview notes. The drawing room that had witnessed so much tension now carried an air of exhausted relief, though shadows of recent events lingered in every corner. Sebastian Crane's full confession, delivered during his transport to custody, revealed the true scope of his manipulation. He had positioned himself as Mrs. Ashford's protector, while simultaneously creating the very danger from which he planned to save her. Or fail to save her, depending on which outcome better served his financial interests. The loosened parapet stones were meant to create a controlled accident, timed to coincide with his presence as either savior or beneficiary, depending on how their relationship progressed and whether she had altered her will in his favor. The terrible irony, Inspector Craddock reflected, closing his notebook with finality, is that Julian's death was genuinely accidental within Sebastian's premeditated scheme. He never intended to kill Thorne, only to eliminate him as competition for Mrs. Ashford's trust and fortune. Miss Marple's needles paused thoughtfully. "Human nature, Inspector, rarely conforms to even the most carefully constructed plans. Mr. Crane understood cameras and chemistry, but not the unpredictable elements of character that ultimately unraveled his scheme." The village's recovery. In the days that followed, Rosehill began its gradual return to normalcy, though the scandal would flavor conversations for seasons to come. Mrs. Calthorpe resigned from all her treasurer positions, her financial irregularities proving to be exactly what she claimed, desperate borrowing for her daughter's medical care. The Photography Society members voted unanimously to forgive the debt, a gesture that brought the formidable woman to tears and revealed the community's fundamental decency beneath its surface proprieties. Arthur Pemberton departed for Scotland with wounded dignity, his plagiarized photographs exposed, but his genuine remorse earning him a measure of redemption. The vicar preached gently but firmly about truth in small matters, and several parishioners adjusted their accounts with surprising alacrity. For Ilara Vance, the resolution brought complicated relief. Her time-lapse photographs had transformed her from prime suspect to key witness, while Tom Miller's steadfast support had finally broken through her melancholic isolation. They were often seen walking together on Rose Hill now, reclaiming the beautiful landscape from its recent association with violence. New beginnings. Dr. Hartley and Mrs. Ashford announced their engagement 3 months later, a quiet affair that surprised no one who had observed their growing closeness during the investigation. The doctor's unwavering support during her darkest hours had forged a bond stronger than any secret from her past. They planned to sell Meadowbrook House and move to a coastal property, leaving behind the memories that haunted the Hilltop Folly. The Folly itself stood cordoned off pending repairs that the village council had voted to fund immediately. Its dangerous parapet would be rebuilt, though Miss Marple suspected it would be some time before photographers ventured there again, with quite the same carefree enthusiasm. Miss Marple's departure. On her final morning in Rose Hill, Miss Marple walked slowly through the village one last time, her knitting bag containing a completed tea cozy patterned with intricate roses, a parting gift for Lavinia Rook. The peaceful lanes and cottage gardens showed no outward signs of the drama that had recently unfolded, yet she knew the residents would carry a deeper understanding of how easily darkness could hide beneath respectability's veneer. "Will you return, Miss Marple?" Ilara asked, as a small group gathered to bid farewell. "Perhaps, my dear, when Rose Hill has had time to heal properly," Miss Marple replied, gazing toward the hill that gave the village its name. "Communities have remarkable resilience when faced with shared adversity." Inspector Craddock arrived to escort her to the station, his respect for his aunt's methods having deepened once again. "Another case closed, Aunt Jane, though I must say your approach remains delightfully unorthodox." "Knitting teaches patience, Inspector, and village life teaches one about human nature," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile. "When you understand people, their prides, their jealousies, their desperate schemes, you find that murder is often just the unraveling of a very tangled skein." As the train carried her away from Rose Hill, Miss Marple reflected on the case's essential lesson. Sebastian Crane had tried to control human behavior like a photographer controls light and shadow, but life refused to be fixed in place like a chemical emulsion. The last photograph taken on Rose Hill had indeed captured something profound, not in its visible image, but in the hidden truths it had helped expose, reminding her once again that beneath every peaceful village surface, secrets waited to be revealed by those patient enough to observe and wise enough to understand the infinite variations of human nature. In a song. St. Mary Mead, her garden, and her next knitting project awaited, along with whatever mysteries village life might next unfold.